Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another section of our series of lecture on philosophy and the visual arts. Today, we're glad joined by Dr. Mark Windsor from Uppsala University. Dr. Windsor is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Philosophy at Uppsala University, an associate editor of Aesthetica, the journal, and a trustee of British Society of Aesthetics. His primary specialism is in aesthetics and philosophy of art, but he also has a research interest in philosophy of mind. His most recent publications are The Uncanny as the Anti-Sublime and Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, Hume's Two Standards of Taste, a response to Kim, and the British Journal of Aesthetics, Imagine the Past of the Present, in Philosophical Quarterly, and Keepsakes at the Routledge Handbook of Nostalgia. So now I'll present also in Portuguese. Boa tarde, boa noite a todos e todas que nos acompanham. Bem-vindos a outra sessão do nosso ciclo de conferências sobre filosofia e artes visuais. Hoje nós temos o prazer de receber o Dr. Mark Windsor, da Universidade de Uppsala, na Suécia. O Dr. Windsor ele é bolsista de pós-doutorado Marie Curie no Departamento de Filosofia da Universidade de Uppsala, editor associado da revista Estética e membro do Conselho da Sociedade Britânica de Estética. Suas especialidades são em estética e filosofia da arte, mas também tem interesse em pesquisa na área de filosofia da mente. E suas publicações mais recentes são The Uncanny as Anti-Sublime, no Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, Hume's Two Standards of Taste, A Response to Kim, no British Journal of Aesthetics, Imagine the Past of the Present, no Philosophical Quarterly, and Keepsake, no Routledge Handbook of Nostalgia. Hoje o Dr. Mark Windsor vai nos agraciar com a conferência The Aesthetic Value of Hallucinations, ou seja, o valor estético das alucinações. So today, Dr. Windsor will present us with the conference, The Aesthetic Value of Hallucinations. Mark, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Romulo, for the invite, for the warm introduction, and everyone for joining. It's a great pleasure. Apologies for those of you for the timing issue. Time zones are confusing. So I'm aware that for a conference series on philosophy and visual arts, that this is perhaps a little bit odd, because I'm not really talking about anything that's focused on the arts, but I will touch on the question of the relationship with the arts at the end. But it's very much focused on aesthetics. This is a work in progress. It's something I've been thinking about and developing. So I'd be very keen to hear any questions or any comments or suggestions at the end. Okay, so the main question I want to focus on is, can hallucinations be aesthetically valuable? And you might think that the answer to this question is just kind of obvious, right? You might think, well, of course they can. Well, in fact, many people count hallucinations among the most powerful aesthetic experiences that they have, right? So this is reported anecdotally, but there are also empirical studies where people report this. But while there's a growing body of literature in philosophy on psychedelic experience and hallucinations, and particularly in relation to therapeutic application of psychedelic experiences, so far there really hasn't been anything on this area in aesthetics. And in fact, when hallucinations or psychedelic experiences do get mentioned in aesthetics, they're normally mentioned with a kind of air of suspicion, right? And I'll come back to this and give you an example later. So I think it is a worthwhile project asking this question: can hallucinations or psychedelic experiences be aesthetically valuable? So that's my primary aim in this paper, is I want to defend the aesthetic value of hallucinations. And this kind of headline aim can be broken down into two smaller sub-aims. So really the main motivation for my paper here is to clear the ground for developing an aesthetics of hallucinations and psychedelic experience, right? So I kind of want to try and get rid of some of the possible obstacles or skeptical worries that might get in the way of developing a positive aesthetics of hallucinations and psychedelic experience. But there's also another aim, which I'll touch on at the end, and that is, I think hallucinations and psychedelic experience might provide an interesting way of approaching or thinking about certain long-standing questions in aesthetics. Okay, so my plan for the talk is to begin by presenting some reports of hallucinations, and specifically visions which are had under the influence of the drug mescaline, which comes, as some of you may know, comes from this kind of cactus, this peyote cactus, and other cacti as well. And these reports describe them as being kind of very richly aesthetic. I'm then going to explicate and defuse some possible reasons from aesthetics for denying that hallucinations can be aesthetically valuable. So I'm going to try to kind of articulate why one might deny that they can, and then to show why those reasons ultimately don't work. And then at the very end, as I mentioned, I'll come to this question of how hallucinations or other states of altered consciousness might help us approach questions in aesthetics. But before I get to any of that, I want to just cover some preliminaries. So in that introduction I've just given you, I've been talking about hallucinations on the one hand, and I've been talking about psychedelic experiences on the other hand, and I've been kind of, jumbling them up a little bit. So I want to clarify this and do some, conceptual, some definitions of terms to clarify what we're talking about. So here's a definition of an hallucination. So I've pulled this is from the psychological literature, and it's a definition that's pretty widely accepted in psychology and medical literature and philosophy as well. So the people kind of debate the details, but the broad strokes are very widely accepted. So an hallucination is a sensory experience which occurs in the absence of corresponding external stimulation of the relevant sensory organ, has a sufficient sense of reality to resemble a veridical perception, over which the subject does not feel that she or he has direct and voluntary control. So really the key idea here is that you've got perceptions, you've got veridical perceptions where you have a perceptual experience of an object, and that experience is causally linked up in the right way with an object in your environment, which is present to your sensory organs, right? Whereas hallucinations, you have a kind of perceptual experience or a perception-like experience, but it's not causally linked up in the right way to any object in your environment, right? So hallucinations can, of course, be caused by psychedelic drugs or other psychoactive drugs, but they can actually have many different causes, many kind of natural causes, so to speak. So there are pathological conditions, things like schizophrenia, migraines, epilepsy, temporal lobe seizures, sensory deprivation. So, you get these like sensory deprivation tanks. So people frequently experience hallucinations if they're put in those for a long enough time. Sensory loss. So Charles Bonnet syndrome is a syndrome that affects people that lose their vision. And I forget the number, but quite a high proportion of people that lose their sight will start experiencing visual hallucinations. Various kinds of sleep disorders or sleep deprivation, And one that really particularly interests me is this phenomenon that's referred to as hypnagogia. So this is a phenomenon that occurs in the transition between waking and sleeping, typically when you're falling asleep. And it fairly commonly people experience these visions, which are actually described as being remarkably similar to the mescaline visions that I will be talking about. So geometric colors, geometric patterns, and often more complex figurative scenes, and they're kind of played out almost like a cinema projection. And they're described as being incredibly highly detailed, so way more detailed than normal perceptions are. And typically this is experienced with people when people have their eyes closed. But they have a kind of feeling of reality to them, right? It's not, there's something really quite different to dreams. So perhaps some of you in the audience have experienced these things. And hallucinations are given this very, very wide variety of causes. Hallucinations are pretty common among the population. So one study sampling over 13,000 people, and these were kind of just regular folk like you and I, not people in institutions, reported that 38%, over 38% reported having had hallucinatory experiences at some point. Okay, so that's hallucinations. So what about psychedelic experiences? So I'm interested in hallucinations, and I think this kind of forms part of psychedelic experience. So I'm interested in both of these things. So what is a psychedelic experience? Well, it's an experience had under the influence of a psychedelic or hallucinogenic drug. So you might find this interesting. The etymology of the term psychedelic comes from the Greek psyche, meaning mind or soul, and delos, meaning manifesting. So literally it's mind manifesting drugs, right? And this was coined by this guy called Humphrey Osmond in a letter to Aldous Huxley. I'll be talking about him very shortly. So hallucinations, in the sense that I was just talking about them, are an important feature of these psychedelic experiences, which are caused by drugs like LSD, magic mushrooms, mescaline. But not all of these psychedelic experiences involve hallucinations in that sense that I just defined, right? So they might be hallucinogenic, in a kind of broader sense. But my main focus today will be on hallucinations in that kind of stricter sense, which is a common feature of psychedelic experience. Okay, so I'm interested in the possibility of developing an aesthetics of psychedelic experiences. So you might think, well, where do we go, right? Where do you start? And I think a really good place to start would be the obvious place, and that would be Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception. So I'm guessing this is familiar to many of you. So there's very famous accounts that Aldous Huxley wrote of his experience of taking mescaline in the kind of mid-20th century. And mescaline is the drug that's found naturally occurring in cacti, peyote cacti, and other forms of cacti. So what's kind of a little bit funny about Huxley's account is that he opens it by telling the reader what he expected that he was going to experience, and that is these kinds of visions, these hallucinations, right? So he writes here, I had expected to lie with my eyes shut, looking at visions of many colored geometries, of animated architectures, rich with gems and fabulously lovely, of landscapes with heroic figures, of symbolic dramas trembling perpetually on the verge of the ultimate revelation. But what I had expected did not happen. So he's kind of disappointed. He didn't have the full-blown hallucinations. And here he goes on, quote, the other world to which mescaline admitted me was not the world of visions. It existed out here, in which I could see with my eyes open. And he goes on to describe the kinds of alterations to his experience of real objects around him that occurred during this psychedelic experience. And one of those objects that he describes that's particularly memorable near the beginning of the account is a vase of flowers in his study, on the desk in his study, just with three or so flowers in there. And he describes how the flowers were shining with their own inner light and all but quivering under the pressure of the significance with which they were charged. A transience that was yet eternal life, a perpetual perishing that was at the same time pure being, the divine source of all existence. So he didn't have these kinds of inner visions that he was hoping for, but he had a kind of very special and powerful experience nonetheless. So the question is, like, how would we go about, trying to develop an account of the aesthetics of these kinds of psychedelic experiences? Well, what I want to suggest is that we should distinguish. This would be a good place to start. Would be to distinguish three distinct objects of psychedelic aesthetic experience, right? Which some of which could overlap. So there's only really one published account in the recent Anglophone literature in aesthetics that deals with these kinds of experiences, and that is T. Newen. His account of the aesthetics of drugs. That's the title of the chapter, and it came out only last year. Now, he's interested in any psychoactive drug. So actually one of his main examples is the effect of tea. So, something nothing like as potent as the kinds of things that I'm mostly talking about here. And T's focus in this chapter is on changes that occur in one's own mental states and processes. Right? So this is his account of the aesthetics of drugs. As he puts it, it's a self-reflexive aesthetics. So you're reflecting on how your own mental states and processes have been altered by the effect of the drugs. This seems helpful, right? I think this is certainly going to be part of the picture we want to tell, but it seems like there are other important parts too, and perhaps the one that T is talking about isn't the most important. So if we think about Huxley's accounts, what's going to be the most important thing is understanding the alteration of those objects one experiences as they are altered. Right? So it's not going to be an experience directed to the self, but it's going to be directed out to the objects, right? As they're altered by the influence of the drug. Right? So, how do we account for objects shining with their own inner light, quivering under the pressure of significance? So I think that's going to be another really important type of object of psychedelic aesthetic experience. And then there's going to be a third type as well, and that's the type of experience that Huxley didn't have. And that is, in his words, the world of visions, or as I've put it in the title of my talk, hallucinations. Right? So that is to say, experiences of non-existent objects and scenes. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on these hallucinations in type 3, but actually a lot of the kind of worries that I'm going to articulate and respond to about whether these experiences can be aesthetically valuable would actually apply to 1 and 2 as well. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Okay, so Huxley talked about how he was kind of hoping for this world of visions. It didn't happen, and he mentions specifically two previously published accounts of mescaline experiences, which do describe in detail these visions. So I'm going to quote from some of these to give you an idea of them. They're just interesting in themselves, but really the key point for me here today is that these experiences are described as being highly aesthetically valuable, right? Like, oh, really, like, super beautiful. Okay, so the first one is from Weir Mitchell, who's a prominent physician working in America at the end of the 19th and very early 20th century. And he took this kind of dose of mescaline, and then he wrote up his experience and published it in a medical journal, right? What's actually particularly funny about this is that he took some kind of lowish dose to begin with, some point during the day, and then kind of went about his regular business. He was going on calls and seeing patients and stuff. and then he went home and took even more. And that's when the experiences that I'm just about to describe occurred. So he says that he closed his eyes and, quote, began to see tiny points of light, and then something like fragments of stained glass windows. He then was hoping for kind of even more powerful closed-eye visualization. So he went upstairs to his bedroom and lay down and closed his eyes. And then he writes, the display which for an enchanted 2 hours followed was such as I find it quite hopeless to describe in language, which shall convey to others the beauty and splendor of what I saw. So from these kind of geometric patterns and colors and lights develop much more complex figurative scenes. And this is characteristic of mescaline visions. They start with kind of more simple geometric forms and colors and then become increasingly complex. So among those complex figures and scenes that he experienced, quote, a white sphere of grey stone, which grew up to huge heights and became a tall, richly finished Gothic tower of very elaborate and definite design, covered or hung with clusters of what seemed to be huge precious stones, some being more like masses of transparent fruit. All seems to possess an interior light and to give the faintest idea of the perfectly satisfying intensity and purity of these gorgeous colour fruits is quite beyond my power. And there's another report that was published just a couple of years after Mitchell's, and this is another physician, but this one, an English physician, Havelock Ellis, and much the same kind of story. He took some mescaline to experiment on himself and wrote it up and published it in a journal. And he describes kind of kaleidoscopic images, symmetrical groupings of geometric forms. And then he talks about how they became more complex. So he talks about flower-like shapes, endless folds of glistening, iridescent, fibrous wings of wonderful insects. And one thing that's interesting about Ellis's account is that he notes that he could still see these visions even if he opened his eyes. So he remarks that they were less intense, they were less brilliant, I think is the word he uses, but you could still see them kind of overlaid on real scenes. And I think this kind of justifies the use of the word hallucination for this, right? So it's if these could only occur with one's eyes closed, you might think, are these really hallucinations? But yeah, incidentally, if you have any kind of problem with the word hallucination and prefer vision, like I'm fine with that, right? Vision, hallucination. Yeah, I'm not kind of overly attached to the word hallucination. Okay, so before I move on, I wanted to give you something kind of visual, and I think in some sense these drawings, which are by a French-Belgian artist and poet, Henri Michaud, who took mescaline around the 1950s and produced a series of drawings based on the experience. And I've done a presentation before where I showed these, and I kind of, people said to me in the Q&A, like, oh, I don't really find those very beautiful. And I was like, oh, I think in some ways they kind of, they in some ways they kind of lessen the impact of the descriptions. But yeah, so maybe try to use your imagination. Like imagine actually experiencing this. Not only seeing it in a depiction, right? It's going to be a very different story, presumably. Okay, so we've got these reports, and they could be multiplied. I think I've said enough to make the point, hopefully very vividly, which is that these experiences are described as being not just beautiful but intensely beautiful. Now, so you might think, well, why on earth would we, question whether these experiences can be aesthetically valuable? So I mentioned in the beginning, in the introduction, that when hallucinations or psychedelic experience have been talked about in aesthetics, it's often with a kind of air of suspicion, right? So I'm just going to give you one example of that suspicion of psychedelic experiences. So there are more. Well, there's at least one more I can think of, but hopefully this will kind of suffice to make the point. So in a recentish paper, James Shelley uses a hypothetical drug-induced hallucination to argue against a view about the nature of aesthetic value. So this is, I think, it's fair to say, the dominant view about the nature of aesthetic value, aesthetic empiricism, as it's called. And it's the view that aesthetic value is grounded on the value of experiences. So traditionally, these were thought of as being pleasurable experiences. More recently, theorists prefer to talk about experiences that are rewarding for their own sake, right? I mean, they don't necessarily need to be pleasurable, but the basic idea is that the aesthetic value is coming from the experience. So Shelley wants to argue against this, and so he asks us to imagine a drug that affords an experience that has the same phenomenal character as the experience of a great work of art. So Shelley doesn't give this example, but you just think of any great work of art. So let's say Picasso's Guernica. So what Shelley argues is that the empiricist must be committed to the view that the drug, the hypothetical drug, has the same aesthetic value as the artwork, right? Because it affords an experience that has the same value. The experience is phenomenologically, it's qualitatively indistinguishable. So, it must have the same value qua experience. But surely that's absurd to suggest that the drug has the same value as the same aesthetic value as the artwork. So yeah, there's another example of this kind of suspicion where someone uses a psychedelic experience as a kind of counterexample to an aesthetic theory, and that's Munro Beardsley. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to present it to you. Okay, so this brings me to the question. So should we trust the prima facie evidence that we have these experiences which are supposedly highly aesthetically valuable, or maybe we should be a little bit more suspicious, right? So for my focus in the remainder of the paper will be trying to tease out reasons for why we might want to deny that hallucinations can be aesthetically valuable, and then I'm going to kind of aim to to refute each one. How am I doing for time? Yeah, not too bad. Okay, I think we're okay. Okay, so the first reason, so to start with, you might think, so the point of Shelley's paper is that we shouldn't think of aesthetic value as being a property of experiences. We should think of aesthetic value as being a property of objects, right? The objects that those experiences are of, right? Objects like Picasso's Guernica or what have you. So you might think, well, if that view is correct, so Shelley calls it the object theory of aesthetic value. You might think, if that view is correct, does that not pose a problem for hallucinations? Because hallucinations don't have objects, you might think. And yet, it's not obvious that the view does pose any problems for hallucinations, because hallucinations do, in a sense, have objects, of course. They have internal objects. They might not have external objects, right? So people like Shelley, who defends the object theory, won't necessarily have any problem with hallucinations, not at least at that level. So the question is, should we expect that aesthetically valuable experiences have some kind of external objects, right? So why would you think that they should? Well, here's one reason why you might think that they should. So there's this very influential paper by Sherry, a great paper as well, by Sherry Irvin, called Scratching an Itch. And this is a paper that's normally kind of located in the field of everyday aesthetics. And she argues that the experience of scratching an itch can be an aesthetically rewarding experience, right? I mean, and it's interesting because it kind of poses a challenge to certain received views about the nature of aesthetic value and aesthetic experience. So in a response to this paper by Irvin, Brian Soucek wants to deny this claim. And he offers several reasons for why we should deny it. But the main one, and the one that's really relevant for me, is that he suggests that objects of aesthetic experiences, aesthetically valuable objects, must be publicly available. Right? So this would rule out hallucinations, and they even mention hallucinations in this exchange, right? as a kind of suspicious case. Right? So how does Soucek support this idea that objects of aesthetic experiences must be publicly available? Well, he does that by adverting to a notion, as many of you know, was central to 18th century accounts of the aesthetic, so disinterestedness, right? So the basic idea is that aesthetic pleasure can't be based on one's own personal, private interest, but rather it must be something that's kind of universalizable. So I've got like this nice drawing that was done by my nephew on my bookshelf at home, and I love it, because my nephew did it, right? So I have a kind of interested pleasure in the drawing. Or you might think about like a collector who really likes a work because it's a great investment, right? It keeps getting more expensive, what have you. So what Soucek suggests is that the fact that this idea about aesthetic pleasure being disinterested points to aesthetic objects being public, in some sense public. So I'm just going to quote it, Soucek. The point of these formative early attempts to describe the aesthetic was precisely to divide the public and disinterested, on the one hand, from all that is selfish, private, or ontologically limited to me alone, on the other hand. So how should we respond to this? Well, I think this appeal to disinterestedness just simply doesn't support the claim, the idea that aesthetic objects must be publicly available, right? So on the one hand, the fact that something is publicly available does not mean that the pleasure that we take in it is necessarily going to be disinterested, right? It's certainly the case that things which are, it's just kind of obvious, I think. And nor does the fact that something is private mean that whatever pleasure we take in it is going to be interested, right? So to put this point differently, it doesn't seem to me to be anything that would preclude one taking a disinterested pleasure in private objects. And we can think of analogous cases to try and support this. So we can imagine an art collector who has a work and they just keep it for themselves. They don't let anyone else see it. But to suggest that reason, for that reason, that they somehow can't take a kind of disinterested pleasure in the work and just regard it, just regard it for its formal arrangements and what have you, it just kind of seems absurd, really. And I think one thing that's worth noting here is that the way people describe their hallucinations or visions is such that they often describe themselves as being like detached observers of them, right? So they describe a kind of disinterested stance towards them, almost like they were watching a movie or something. Okay, so let me now turn to the second reason why I think you might want to deny hallucinations can be aesthetically valuable, and this is very closely related to the first, right? And that is that you might worry about whether normative standards of aesthetic judgment can apply to hallucinations. So when we're thinking about disinterestedness in relation to aesthetics, really this seems to be the main motivation for doing so, right? We want disinterestedness because it allows us to achieve a kind of objectivity of aesthetic judgment, right? So you might think, and certainly Kant and others did think this, that aesthetic judgments necessarily must be kind of objective in this sense that they have a kind of intersubjective validity. So why would this be a worry for hallucinations? Well, it might be a worry if you think that this intersubjective validity depends on objects being shareable among a community of appreciators. Right? So to try to make this kind of clearer, we might think of an analogy here. So Wittgenstein's famous argument against the possibility of a private language, right? This idea that there can be no such thing as a meaningful language that's made up solely by someone on their own, right? Language is fundamentally a social phenomenon. And so we might think that the aesthetic judgments and the normativity of aesthetic judgments also is essentially a kind of social phenomenon, right? So the idea that you could have an object of aesthetic judgment that's in principle can only be had by one person might seem to kind of preclude this possibility of having a kind of objectivity of aesthetic judgment. I don't think we need to worry about this either, right? And so I think there are two main points I want to say in response to this. So first point is that it's not perhaps unlike the language case, it's not clear to me that normative standards of aesthetic judgment are only learned in a kind of community, right? It also seems plausible that they are, at least to some degree, kind of innate, like biologically grounded, right? We are just innately disposed to find some things beautiful or ugly or what have you. But even, you might not be convinced by that, and what have you. But even if you don't buy that, even if it were the case that normative standards of aesthetic judgments are kind of fundamentally a communal affair, there still doesn't really seem to be any reason why this couldn't apply to hallucinations, to objects which are in principle private. So it might be that you learn the standards of aesthetic judgment as part of a community in response to publicly shareable objects, but having so learned those standards, there doesn't seem to me to be any reason why you couldn't then apply them to private objects of experience, right? So in principle, it does seem to me like one could be wrong in one's aesthetic judgments of an hallucination. But something I'll just kind of note here to support this idea that there is a kind of normativity of aesthetic normativity of hallucinations is, well, the kinds of scenes that Mitchell and Ellis and others describe, they talk about gemstones and kind of iridescent wings of butterflies and insects and this kind of thing. Those things sound like, objectively speaking, beautiful things to experience, right? If they were talking about, worms and beetles and dirt and stuff, and then saying, wow, so beautiful, maybe we would kind of question that, right? Okay, so I'm now going to move to the third and final reason that I want to discuss. And that is that maybe hallucinations can't be aesthetically valuable because they can't be understood, and some kind of understanding of an object is necessary for aesthetic experience. So several theorists in aesthetics have argued this, that aesthetic appreciation necessarily requires a kind of intellectual understanding of the object, and they want to use this as a way of distinguishing aesthetic pleasures and experience from kind of merely sensory pleasures. So one such theorist is Roger Scruton. So he talks about how aesthetic pleasure is not so much an effect of its object as a mode of understanding it. So the thought would be, you can have a nice ice lolly on a hot day, and it's kind of always like cooling and refreshing and lovely. You can get that kind of pleasure from the ice lolly, and you don't really need to understand the object, right? It's just the pleasure is just an effect of the object. Whereas aesthetic pleasures, this is the idea, are something more intellectual. Right? They come about from cognizing the object. More recently, Elizabeth Schellekens has developed what she calls a noetic, which is to say intellectual account of aesthetic experience, according to which to aesthetically experience an object is to engage in a process of explorative thought about the object. Okay, so what exactly would the worry be with hallucinations? Well, the worry would be that when you're hallucinating, you don't have the cognitive faculty with you to be able to understand the object in the way that some people think aesthetic experience requires. Right? Hallucinating might involve some kind of impairment to one's cognitive faculties that would preclude that kind of understanding. Now, I do think that this could be a genuine worry in some cases, right? So perhaps someone might be hallucinating and they might not even know that they're hallucinating. This is probably uncommon with psychedelic experiences, but with the other kinds of cases, it can be quite common. And this is more relevant to the psychedelic cases, you might have just taken an extremely high dose of something which has left you cognitively impaired. Surely this can happen. So I accept that this could be a worry in some cases. But what I want to suggest is that even if it is a worry in some cases, there are surely many cases where people experience these kind of visions, these hallucinations, and they do have the mental capacity to understand and cognitively reflect on the object of experience, the hallucination. Indeed, this precisely seems to be the case with the reports that I opened with. So Weir Mitchell and Havelock Ellis. So, and in fact, they both remark upon this in their reports. So here's Weir Mitchell. He writes, "I was critically attentive, watchful, interested, and curious, making all the time mental notes for future use." And Havelock Ellis suggests that it's actually a kind of general feature of the drug mescaline that people's cognitive faculties and their judgment kind of remains reasonably clear. So he writes, "The mezcal drinker remains calm and collected amid the sensory turmoil around him." Right, so you're having these like mad perceptual experiences or perception-like experiences. But judgment is as clear as in normal state. Now, there might be other reasons. Well, I'm sure there are other reasons why one might doubt whether hallucinations can be aesthetically valuable. So, if there are any of note and you want to raise them in Q&A, I'd be really grateful for that. Now, just in remaining, how are we doing for time? I need to finish soon, don't I? So, just in the remaining 5 minutes, I'm just gonna conclude and highlight two avenues for future research. So, it seems to me that psychedelic experiences and other states of altered consciousness or mind manifesting, so psychedelic in the literal sense of in the etymological sense. These kinds of experiences might be the last major area of uncharted territory in aesthetics. So if you think about the history of aesthetics since, I don't know, let's just say the 20th century anyway, discussions of art were absolutely dominant for a long time. And then around the 1970s, the aesthetics of nature and environmental aesthetics gained increasing attention. And then since about the 1990s, this field of research called everyday aesthetics gained traction and is now a widely recognized subdiscipline. So what's left? What's left? Why, perhaps this is what's left, and that is the aesthetics of altered consciousness, right? So I do think, maybe whether or not altered consciousness or psychedelic experiences gain the same level of attention that these other areas have, I do think that there's a gap here. There's lots of work that is just simply not done and is yet to be done. So my main aim in this paper has been really on trying to just clear the ground for developing this work, right? So just trying to address kind of skeptical worries that might get in the way of developing an aesthetics of psychedelic experiences or hallucinations. So I mentioned at the very beginning that there's been a lot of research going on in the 90s on psychedelic experiences. So some people talk about a psychedelics renaissance, and this is true in philosophy as well. There's at least, perhaps not a huge, but a growing body of literature in philosophy on psychedelic experiences, focusing on the therapeutic application. So my hope is that if some attention to this area can be garnered in aesthetics, that a kind of a two-way exchange can take place. So on the one hand, aesthetics can shed light on the nature of psychedelic experience. And I've at least kind of touched on some of the directions that we might go in to do that. And on the other hand, I think this is an interesting thing, is that psychedelic experience might help shed light on certain questions, certain long-standing questions in aesthetics. So I think one question that psychedelic experience or hallucinations might shed light on is about the nature of aesthetic value. Right? So I mentioned already that the traditional view about aesthetic value is that it's grounded on the value of experiences, right? That fundamentally, aesthetic value is a property of experiences, not objects. But there's been an increasing shift now to the view that actually maybe aesthetic value is fundamentally a property of objects. And increasingly, a number of people have been defending quite a kind of a robust form of aesthetic realism, which holds that aesthetic value is, doesn't just belong to objects, but it's actually a mind-independent property of objects. Well, if hallucinations can be aesthetically valuable, this, I think, is going to be a challenge, or at least a kind of something that is potentially going to be problematic for this view. Right? Why? Well, because hallucinations, it seems, just are wholly mind-dependent. Right? Now, there's a hell of a lot more that one would need to say on this question, and that's actually something that I've been trying to develop in tandem, which is still very much work in progress. So yeah, so watch this space. I might just have to abandon this suggestion. So here's another way that hallucinations and psychedelic experiences might shed light on questions for aesthetics, and one of those is thinking about sources of artistic creativity, and another is thinking about sources of aesthetic normativity. Right? So in other words, like what determines good and bad in aesthetic questions of aesthetic value. So many people have observed that in hallucinations, there are these recurring patterns, these recurring geometric forms that occur. So these occur in psychedelic experiences, as it, for example, under the influence of mescaline, but also in other kinds of hallucinations too. So, migraines or the kind of hypnagogic visions that I mentioned very briefly at the start. So there was a researcher, Heinrich Kluwer, who described these in the kind of middle of the 20th century, called them form constants, and he identified several of them: lattices, cobwebs, tunnels, spirals. So one thing that's interesting about this is that similar kinds of patterns can be observed in folk art going way back to prehistory, and this is across many, many cultures, right? So in other words, it seems like these forms that show up in psychedelic experiences have been an important source of artistic inspiration. And another kind of tantalizing thought is that maybe these forms, which obviously reveal something about the kind of biological makeup of our cognitive architecture, could explain or partly explain our kind of preferences, our aesthetic value judgments, right? The good and the bad. So it might be a kind of primitive source, a kind of biologically grounded source of aesthetic normativity. Okay, and on that thought, I will finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your very interesting presentation. Now we have time to some discussion. I have received some questions I tried to put here. First of all, I'd like to, if I may, to ask you something concerning your final concern about the fact that the problem of hallucinations to be full mind dependent. So you said, what is it? Yeah, you said that you don't mind using hallucinations or visions, right?
Yeah.
My question is, do you make a distinction between, or if there is a distinction in literature between hallucinations and delusions? The latter also are not communicable. They are not publicly available. They are not a matter of knowledge. Would they have aesthetic value? Because delusions, one might say, that are also full mind dependence. We have the problem of the first person perspective. How to do, if you have considered that in some way.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I hadn't, I have to say. So my thoughts about delusion. My immediate response would be I hadn't considered delusions as potentially aesthetically valuable phenomena, because it doesn't seem to me like they're experiential, right? They don't really. They're like delusions, I would have thought, are boiled down to false judgments or false beliefs. And I wouldn't, or something like that, roughly. Does anyone work on delusions here? And so, I mean, it's just simply not obvious to me that such things would be, even like candidates for being aesthetically valuable. But maybe this is just way too quick. So, do you have any? Yes. So just to clarify, my thought would be that delusions are a cognitive matter. They're a matter of having false beliefs, and that doesn't seem to me like the right kind of thing to be a candidate for being an aesthetically valuable experience. Whereas hallucinations are, we should think of them either as perceptual experiences or perception-like experiences, and this is the kind of thing that we should think of at least as a candidate for being aesthetically valuable.
Okay, Thank you very much. We have here a question, is like a little bit long question, so I will put in sections. So the first part is that I will exhibit, and on the play, and I read it. Heidegger argues, there's a Heideggerian question, argues that art disclosed through aletheia, revealing the being of beings. So, in what sense can a hallucination, which conceals rather than reveals the world, participate in such a truth disclosure?
Thank you. I'm going to make a use of that.
And we have, I don't know if we have a second part of the of the question. Let's see if I'm how to share this. Let's see. So now, the second part is, if aesthetic value can arise from hallucination, does this not reduce the aesthetics to mere intensity or effect? A move that Heidegger would criticize as neglecting the ontological grounding of art. We have a Heideggerian watching us, so.
No, that's fine. I mean, so I should preface this by saying that I really don't. I'm a complete Heidegger novice, so I don't really. I'm not in a position to speak about Heidegger's philosophy. I do think there's probably loads of really interesting things to say here, and I'm just trying to sort them out in my own mind. So I think. So one thing that's just interesting to observe is that the way Huxley talked about his experience of mescaline, which was kind of not an hallucination in that narrow sense that I was talking about it, but was a kind of psychedelic experience, but it was an experience of real objects in the world. And he very much talked about it as an experience that was revealing the being of those objects to him. Now, many people who write about psychedelics now would be pretty skeptical about those kinds of descriptions from Huxley, right? So the worry would be that these experiences are not. So even in that case, when you're experiencing real objects around you, like, the drug is not giving you this truth-revealing experience about the object. So it's kind of like, it's altering your experience of those objects. But many people, even if they're kind of skeptical about the idea that we can kind of tap into some ultimate reality through these drugs, and to be honest, I would be skeptical of that too, do think that they can be in some way, I think, cognitively rewarding, like can reveal some kind of truths, maybe not about the being of objects, but they can reveal truths about our own there are our own cognitive mechanisms, right? They can make us aware of the kind of, like, for example, of the fragility and the contingency of our psychological apprehension of the world, or something like this. I'm not sure how well that really kind of gets to the question. I suspect really that what I'm talking about just doesn't really kind of fit with what Heidegger was interested in, not least because he was primarily interested in art and aesthetics. He wasn't really interested in nature, let alone everyday aesthetics, let alone like psychedelics,
So we have another question from the history of philosophy. Now it's not for the ancient ones, is that Plato regarded illusion and imitation with suspicion, seeing them as distancing us from the truth.
Yeah.
How would you respond to the Platonic concern, or how could these authors respond to Platonic concern that hallucinations being detached from reality can only produce aesthetic deception, not genuine value.
Yeah, I think, yeah, so in some ways, not wholly dissimilar to the last question. So I think if you think that the value, if you think that the value is in the reality of the object, and that in the for the experience to be valuable, we need to kind of try and get as close to that reality out there as possible, then I think what I'm talking about probably isn't going to gel with that perhaps too well. Yeah, again, what I would say is, I mean, maybe just to try and clarify, like, the way I'm thinking about, I mean, to lay my cards on the table, right? I think that the aesthetic value, comes from the experience. Right? It doesn't come from the objects.
Yes.
That kind of causes the experience, right? So I think, whether there is an artwork or not doesn't really, it doesn't really, in some sense, doesn't really matter about whether the experience is going to be aesthetically valuable. Obviously, an artwork's going to give you a different kind of experience than a drug, or an experience that has a different kind of aesthetic value. But I don't see any kind of major concern to having experiences that don't have external objects, right? Just experiences that are just experiences. So, like the famous thought experiment, the experience machine. Who is it? Is it Novitz or something? And he's kind of uses this to kind of leave a view to think about kind of ethical values. And I think this is kind of interesting, because if you think about the aesthetic case, like, just having an experience on its own, regardless of what the experience is caused by, whether it represents any kind of external thing in the world, I think just the experience itself is sufficient to realize aesthetic value, right? That was kind of partly my motivation for talking about this topic in the first place, is to try and kind of push back. And I didn't really talk about it much in this talk, but try and push back on this view that's been gaining ground recently in aesthetics, which says that aesthetic value is this kind of metaphysically mind-independent property of objects, and that just seems wrong to me. So I think maybe we're coming from different starting points. Yeah, but thank you very much for the question.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you, and I think that you answered another question is, if hallucinations can be aesthetically valuable, does this not invert Plato's hierarchy, turning illusion to highest aesthetic form? The fact is that if I understood right, in your answer, is that it depends from the starting point, the object or the experience, and how we are dealing with it, right?
I think so, and I'm kind of like, part of the reason why I'm interested in this phenomena is that the way they're described is these experiences are described as being like intensely aesthetically valuable. So it's quite hard to deny that that they can be, right? That's why I think it's an interesting kind of case to use to try and build an argument, right?
Yeah, I would like to know, I would like myself to put some questions or a comment. The problem about the if what is at stake, if the object or the experience, the notion of an aesthetic object itself is not so easy to deal with. For instance, okay, when we talk about a painting or a sculpture, and we have this concrete object towards which we have this experience, and then we could attach aesthetic value to it. So,
Yeah.
as you were in some point, but there are some arts that the very notion of an object, it's quite hard to address, and even in this case, we do not discuss, as you were, the aesthetic value of them. For instance, the when we talk about music,
Yeah.
what is the aesthetic object of music? For instance, we have the uh, Beethoven symphony. What is the object? Is the musical sheet? Is the reproduction? Is, well, it's hard to point out, and we did not discuss that music has an aesthetic value. So the notion of an object for that we are linked to experience, it's it's not so easy to define in this case.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So in the in the piece which I envision writing at some point, which kind of deals with this question, this problem about the realism of aesthetic value, but I'm still quite hazy about it. We'll need to deal with this, right? Because one thought is that actually, start again. So the robust realist. So the robust realist says that aesthetic value is a mind-independent property of objects. But obviously, they don't want to deny that works of music or other repeatable artworks can be aesthetically valuable, because that would be kind of crazy, right? They don't want to say that. So they want to say that this kind of mind-independent property of aesthetic value can attach itself to abstract objects, presumably. I mean, it's basically going to come down to the details of the ontology, but I think the only really, it seems to me like the most plausible kind of music work, ontologies of musical works is going to end by saying that there's some kind of abstract object. So you might just say, like, well, so just tell the same story with hallucinations. The objects of hallucinations are abstract objects, and there's no reason why they can't be robustly aesthetically valuable in this kind of mind-independent sense. And what I want to say is that I do think there's an important ontological difference. This is what I need to develop this. So I'm glad you asked, because I do think it's really relevant and interesting. There seems to be a difference, which is that artworks kind of have to be, in some sense, public, or at least have the kind of potential to be made such, right? So it doesn't seem like, or I think another way of putting it would be to say that the objects of hallucination seem to be much more intimately tied to an individual's experience than artworks are. So if you think of musical composition, it's something that somehow it has some kind of existence which is kind of independent of the person who created it, right? Once a work of music has been created, it seems to me like, in principle, it doesn't only belong to that individual, right? And I need to find a way of kind of articulating this. Whereas it seems to me like the objects of hallucinations they do only belong to one individual. They can't kind of be detached from that individual's experience. I don't know. I know that's not very clear, and I would like to find a much clearer way of articulating that. But I hope you have some sense of. I want to try and drive a wedge between these two things.
So we have a comment here from not too complicated, but music could be seen as a complete aesthetic object.
Yeah.
He goes on and said that an ephemeral experience tied back to a physical object that transforms physical and perceptual reality in real time. So, yeah, but I don't know if I'll let to you to answer it, but the point is that we have to do how we feel about it, and that is the root of the word aesthetics, the sense, not the object, but yes, the aesthetic comes to the how we feel about it. So we
Yeah.
feel it's about our experience, right? So
Yeah.
I'd like to.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for the comment. Yeah, I think I think that it seemed to be kind of, it certainly seemed relevant and maybe supportive of what we were just talking about. So thank you.
Do you have more comments? Yeah. So yes, the point. Yes, as you said that it's quite interesting to see that the to turn the it's almost like an phenomenological. I'm saying when while I'm thinking of it like a phenomenological approach of the hallucinations. How do we feel about it? So actually, this it's quite and how if it is possible and in what sense and to what extent, better say, uh, can we draw the line between these are valid objects between quotation marks, objects of aesthetic experience, and those are not uh, objects or yes, objects of aesthetic experience. So that's quite interesting.
Those are where the really interesting and difficult questions come in. So I was kind of trying to focus on elsewhere in this talk, but it's funny how like all of the interest kind of goes to these questions. I obviously will need to try and deal with this.
And we can go, if we may, go a little bit deeper. And for instance, let me see how we call it in how we said in English the name of it. Let me see the title in English. Okay. So let's say that hallucinations are not worth of aesthetic value, right? Let's assume that. However, there are work of arts that works like an hallucination. When we can say, for instance, uh, David Lynch, Mulholland Drive. It's have this almost dreaming atmosphere. It's hard to follow this point, but how we can say that an hallucination at the first extent and the first level has no aesthetic value, but a work of art that at some point, at least at some perspective, works like an an hallucination in a film. Like we have this drive and this whole almost no sense experience, and then we can point that okay, that that have aesthetic value. These have an aesthetic value, and the hallucination itself has no aesthetic value or is not worth of an aesthetic experience. It's quite difficult to draw the line, to me at least, at this point. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think. Yeah, thank you. I think that's interesting. I happen to love Lynch. I think his films would often get talked about as being dreamlike, I guess. Hallucinatory, maybe. It doesn't seem obvious to me. I don't think there would be any contradiction in saying that something that inspires something that has aesthetic value wouldn't necessarily have to have aesthetic value, right? I don't. But I take your point. I think those are really interesting cases to consider. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions here in chat or at the email? So if not, so I would like to thank you very much, Mark, for your wonderful presentation and for discussion on the chat, and they were really interesting. The as always, the presentations the conference will stay on our YouTube channel, and we can put some comments there, and once in a while we can read and discuss. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, especially Mark, for your presentation.
Thank you, Romulo, and thank you everyone for joining and for your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, and good night, and see you next time.